Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to give my review of WCW's Road Wild 1997. Starting off the evening, we'll go to our first match of the night. It is a tag team matchup. It is Harlem Heat versus Scott Norton and Buff Bagwell. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Harlem Heat and Scott Norton and Bagwell. Harlem Heat were keeping the pace of the match with Norton hitting a sidewalk slam, but Booker T ultimately hits the finish. Pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are Harlem Heat. Hats off to Harlem Heat for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Rey Mysterio Jr. versus Konnan. I thought this was a good match as well. Back and forth matchup between Mysterio and Konnan, with Konnan hitting a running lariat on Mysterio. Mysterio then gets up, hits a head scissor takedown on Konnan. Konnan then was keeping the pace of the match, with Konnan ultimately applying his signature Tequila Sunrise on Mysterio. And your winner of the match is Konnan. Hats off to Konnan for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Dean Malenko teaming up with Jeff Jarrett versus Steve McMichael and Chris Benoit. I thought this was a good matchup as well. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with Dean and Jeff Jarrett keeping the pace of the match. Benoit then hits a diving headbutt, but McMichael ultimately hits a tombstone pile driver on Malenko, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are Chris Benoit and Steve McMichael. Hats off to Benoit and McMichael for getting a win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Cruiserweight Championship. It is Alex Wright versus Chris Jericho. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Wright and Jericho, with Jericho keeping the pace of the match. Wright lands multiple European uppercuts on Jericho. Jericho then hits a lion salt on Wright in the middle of the ring, but Wright ultimately hits a roll-up on Jericho, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Alex Wright. Hats off to Alex Wright for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Ric Flair versus Syxx. I thought this was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Flair and Syxx, with Flair keeping the pace of the match. Flair then applies a figure 4 leg lock on Syxx, but the hold is broken. Flair ultimately hits a roll up on Syxx using the ropes, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Ric Flair. Hats off to Ric Flair for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is DDP versus Curt Hennig. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between DDP and Hennig, with DDP keeping the pace of the match. DDP then hits a flapjack on Hennig in the middle of the ring. Referee is knocked out. DDP then hits a diamond cutter on Flair. Hennig then ultimately hits a perfect plex on DDP. Pins for the 3. And your winner of the match is Curt Hennig. Hats off to Curt Hennig for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the Giant versus Randy Savage. I thought this was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between the Giant and Savage, with Giant keeping the pace of the match, with the Giant ultimately hitting his signature choke slam on Randy Savage, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is the Giant. Hats off to the Giant for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Tag Team Championships. It is the Outsiders versus the Steiners. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between the Outsiders and the Steiners, with the Outsiders keeping the pace of the match. Steiners ultimately hit the finish. Nash then ultimately pulls the referee out of the ring before the 3 count. And your winners of the match, due to disqualification, are the Steiner brothers. Hats off to the Steiners for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the main event of WCW's Road Wild 1997. It is Lex Luger versus Hollywood Hogan for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Lex and Hogan, with Hogan keeping the pace of the match. NWO was here. Fake Sting is here as well. He ends up hitting Lex Luger. Hogan capitalizes on this, goes for the cover, pins for the 3, And your winner of the match is Hollywood Hogan. Hats off to Hollywood Hogan for getting the win in this matchup. A couple of things I'm going to say about Road Wild 1997, man, before I get out of here. Number one, it was a decent event. I'm not going to sit here and say it was the best or the worst. There was a couple matches on here that I actually genuinely liked. Rey Mysterio Jr. versus Conan was a solid matchup. Malenko and Jarrett teaming up, going up against McMichael and Benoit was a solid match as well. Alex Wright versus Chris Jericho for the Cruiserweight Championship. Again, solid match. The Cruiserweight division for WCW was severely underrated. DDP versus Curt Hennig was also a solid matchup. But Lex Luger versus Hogan, I think that was a solid matchup from top to bottom. Told a great story. And the other biggest thing that I took away from this, and I don't think a lot of people realized at that point, is Sting. I think, when Sting took that sabbatical, and, when Sting came back, in Starrcade in 97, taking that, all that time off, it was one of the biggest storylines that I think people don't realize how long that storyline went with Sting. Because there was times that you saw, Sting in the rafters, watching over matches, especially when it pertained to the NWO. And sometimes you had matches where there was a fake Sting attacking a WCW guy like Lex Luger or the Giant, or so on and so forth. So that was a storyline that was probably going on for well over probably a year. So I don't think a lot of people realize how long that storyline went and how important it was. I mean, when Sting came back as the Crow Sting, the black and white Sting that we all know of and not the Surfer Sting, when he came back as the Crow Sting with the black and white face paint, a lot of people, growing up only know Sting as the Crow Sting and not the blonde hair surfer type, from the early 90s Sting, in the late 80s or mid to late 80s. But that was one of the biggest things I took away from that main event is that, even though it was a fake Sting, this was a storyline that's been going on for so long at that time span between 96 and 97 with Sting. Whether he was going to be in the arena that night or walking the rafters or, trying to take out somebody from the NWO to make sure they don't get to their match. It was one of those long-term booking ideas and long-term booking storylines that, WCW, I think, personally did very well. Now, with that being said, the final product of that and what we got was Hogan versus Sting at Starrcade in 1997, which, personally, I think it was one of the biggest botch finishes in all of professional wrestling besides Shawn and Bret Hart in the Montreal Screwjob. To be honest with you, I think Eric Bischoff and his staff at the time of 1997, especially when it pertained to Starrcade and Sting's return, this was his return match after, taking a sabbatical and being gone for over a year. The official, the first initial pinfall was Hogan, and Hogan, was going to walk away with the championship. And then you have Bret Hart coming out, saying no, and attacking the referee. I believe the ref in that match was Nick Patrick. And then all of a sudden Bret turns into the referee, and then Sting locks in a, Scorpion Deathlock, and Sting's now the winner after the second pinfall, even though this is not a 2 out of 3 falls matchup. So, there was a lot of, obviously confusion in that main event. Long story short is what I'm trying to say is that it is remarkable how long that Eric Bischoff and his team had the Sting storyline going for so long. It also shows you how important a guy like Sting was to that company. Sting was, he was a flagship guy for WCW, in my honest opinion. He was always loyal to WCW, and I think it was something that the company could put, they could put the company on the back of a guy like Sting. Now, again, it goes back to what I said about Starrcade, where Bischoff was kind of on the fence whether he wanted Hogan to walk out with that championship or Sting. But Sting was the right guy to walk out with that championship after, him coming back, being a huge babyface, taking a humongous sabbatical of time away from the company, reinventing himself into the Crow Sting, and, the rest is history, man. I mean, the Crow Sting is one of the best characters, in my honest opinion, in all of professional wrestling. I put it up there with The Undertaker and Kane and Mankind. I 100% do. I think the things that Sting were doing and was doing at that time, I don't think a lot of people would have really, would have done the same thing. Now, obviously, there's guys like Taker and Kane and, Mankind, Mick Foley, stuff like that. But, Sting brought in a whole different dynamic to, especially WCW at that time, because they didn't really have a character like that in WCW. Everything was kind of straight-laced, where you had the NWO. There really wasn't, this... Sting brought in this whole, entity, if you will, to the character, and got a lot of eyeballs on Sting and the product, because you never know what Sting was going to do or where Sting was going to be. And hats off to Sting for doing that, as well as Eric Bischoff with coming up with this character, because, not only did it save Sting's career, but it definitely made people want to watch WCW because you never knew what Sting was going to do next. So that's one thing I took away from the main event. Outsiders and Steiners, I can't say much more about the Outsiders, man. Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, one of the, definitely top tag teams of all time, in my honest opinion. Not for just how many championship titles they've won, but what they did for tag team wrestling and how they changed the business. You're talking about two guys that were, top guys in WWE at the time. In the early 90s, I would say that, Diesel and Razor were two of the biggest names in WWE. With the likes of Shawn Michaels and stuff like that. Even the matches that Razor had in WWE. Everybody remembers the, infamous ladder match that Razor had with Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania 10 for the Undisputed Intercontinental Champion. That match alone, to me, honestly, my favorite WrestleMania of all time is WrestleMania 10. I don't think there's any WrestleMania, for me personally as a fan, that's ever going to top what WrestleMania 10 did for me as a fan. I think it was absolutely awesome. But, for what Diesel has done in his career in WWE, matches he had with Taker, his championship run, matches he's had with Brett, Shawn Michaels, and the same thing with Razor Ramon. Multi-time Intercontinental Champion, put on fantastic matches for the fans, and made a lot of historical moments. This was the same guy that put over, X-Pac or 1-2-3 Kid, if you will, and put him over to make him a superstar in WWE. And Razor really didn't have to do that, but he did. Because I think Razor saw something in X-Pac at that time and saw a star, but, that's, if you're a fan of X-Pac, you're a fan of X-Pac. But you got to give credit where credit's due, man. Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, they really did change the game of professional wrestling. And to have a guy like Hogan to come in and team up with these guys, just changed the entire landscape of professional wrestling, in the early to mid-90s. 100%. Nobody will ever forget the NWO, no matter what. So, again, a lot of respect to the Outsiders of, what, Hall and Nash did for professional wrestling and what they gave to the fans. Ric Flair and Syxx, solid match, like I stated earlier. DDP and Curt Hennig. Again, Curt Hennig's another guy, man, that I mentioned multiple times in the past that I really didn't feel like he got a fair shake in professional wrestling. I think Curt Hennig was your prototypical wrestler. Obviously he comes from a family background with, Larry the Axe Hennig and so on and so forth. He's a great wrestler. I think he's great on the microphone. In-ring ability is uncanny. Nobody can really match what he can do in the ring, except for a select few of guys, in my honest opinion. And to be honest with you, how he wrestled, what he brought to the table, the character itself, he should have been multi-time world champion. And honestly, to me, one of the best Intercontinental champions, not the best, but one of the best Intercontinental champions. And I felt like Curt Hennig could have easily been multi-time world champion. And I stated the same thing, even though it doesn't relate to Curt Hennig. I said the same thing about Rick Rude. I think Rick Rude was your prototypical heel, one of the best heels in the business. Whether he was working with Bobby Heenan or anything else like that, Rick Rude is your prototypical heel. He did a very good job at being a heel. He had the physique. He had the athleticism. He was great on the microphone. People love to hate Rick Rude. He was, a couple times world heavyweight champion. I will give him that. But even in his run in WWE, wasn't like he was a multi-time WWE champion. He held the Intercontinental Championship. And then even his run in WCW, it wasn't, the All-Gold Championship, and a lot of people don't remember this, a lot of the All-Gold Championship wasn't really even recognized as WCW's World Heavyweight Champion until years later. And the reason why I'm saying that is because, Rick Rude held it, but that was a championship that was being divided pretty much between the working relationship between WCW and New Japan Pro Wrestling, because a lot of times it looked like Rick Rude was going head-to-head with Masahiro Chono for this, World Heavyweight Championship that wasn't really recognized as the World Heavyweight Championship of WCW. And a lot of people had to remember that there was two belts that were being defended in WCW that were technically World Heavyweight Championships, but just the all-gold belt was not recognized as WCW's World Heavyweight Champion until years later. When Vader was there, it was the Silver and Blue Championship that Vader was holding at the time, and going back and forth with Ric Flair and having really good matches with Ric Flair. That belt was actually recognized as WCW's World Heavyweight Championship. So, again, like I said, long story short, Rick Rude should have been a guy who's been multi-time world champion as well as Curt Hennig. The Cruiserweight division, I've stated this multiple times in the past, severely underrated. And I'm going to keep reiterating that, man. I mean, the amount of names that have come through that door for the Cruiserweight division is unreal. I mean, absolutely unreal. The amount of talent that's walked through those doors, from Eddie Guerrero to Chris Benoit to Juventud Guerrera, Psychosis, Rey Mysterio Jr., Dean Malenko. That's just to name a couple, man. That's walked through those doors, and wrestled for the Cruiserweight division. I mean, any one of those guys could easily main event any card, even nowadays. I mean, absolute legends in all of professional wrestling, man. And I think Eric Bischoff really didn't know what he had with that Cruiserweight division, man, because I'm telling you right now, that Cruiserweight division was absolutely insane. But all in all, just like I do with every single one of these pay-per-views, you guys know by now, I always give these pay-per-views a rating from 1 out of a 10. 1 being the worst, 10 being the absolute best. This one was kind of it was kind of a mix-up for me, man, honestly. I was kind of back and forth on what, rating I wanted to give Road Wild 1997. And like I stated earlier in the podcast, man, this wasn't the best Road Wild, and it damn sure was not the worst. There was a couple good matches on here. There were some matches I could have done without. But with that being said, I'm going to have to give WCW's Road Wild 1997 a solid rating of a 4 at best. But this is my review of WCW's Road Wild 1997. I hope you guys are out there staying safe. Be careful, and remember, stay classic. Peace.